Revelation study today. We are going to approach Revelation this morning. I had Aiden read chapter 1. We will revisit chapter 1. But the first thing that I want to do is, after we do sort of a basic intro to the letter itself, I want to go over the 7 churches and their locations. I would like to give you some background information on what the Christians of this century and these places were dealing with. And I think once you understand what they were dealing with on a daily basis, I think you can appreciate the letter a little more deeply than if we just were to jump right in and start reading without any context background whatsoever. And you know me, when it comes to historical stuff or archaeological stuff, I'm going to try to dig up, no pun intended, as much stuff as I possibly can in order to help us along our journey with this letter. Because there's going to be a lot here. Okay, I'm already going to go ahead and tell you, when you were listening to Aiden read chapter 1, you were probably like, interesting. A lot of information there, a lot of imagery there, a lot of things going on. That's how the majority of the chapters are. Yeah. Even as he's talking to the 7 churches of Asia, he is going to link the churches to their cities in a way that is fascinating, in my opinion. You're going to see a lot of connections here, okay? That shows us how much, how can I say this, applicable this letter was to the churches it was being written to. There was a reason the letter was being written to them specifically at this era, this time and place and time.
There wasn't any sent to the church in Jerusalem or others that we know of.
Not that we're aware of.
Yeah.
Not that we're aware of. Not saying that this letter didn't make its rounds around other areas. I'm not saying that. But all we know from this letter in particular is that these 7 churches received at least their own copy of this letter, if not the same. But the way he talks to the 7 churches, the way I would imagine is Ephesus received their instruction, Smyrna received their instruction, Thyatira received their instruction, so on and so forth. But it's possible it could have all been together.
They weren't just randomly selected.
No, there is a reason they were selected. You're exactly right. Now, when approaching Revelation, we must do so on the letter's own terms, okay, and not on the most popular viewpoints of our day and time. A lot of the viewpoints that we more commonly see today actually sprouted about around the 18th century, so a little late compared to what the first century Christians would have been interpreting the letter, their viewpoint. So we got to be careful about that. Plus, the letter of Revelation was meant to be revealed, not concealed. We went over that when we studied Daniel. And at the end of Daniel, what did the angel tell Daniel to do with the letters of the prophecy? Everything he had seen, what did the angel tell him?
Close them up.
Roll them up. Why?
Wasn't the right time.
It wasn't the time. But then in Revelation, now I know we haven't gotten here yet, but we'll get there. But the angel tells Daniel to do what with Revelation? Or this prophecy, this vision that he had received. What was it the angel told him? If you were to skip all the way to the end, he didn't tell him to roll up the words and keep it quiet. He said, I want you to not do that. I want you to share this information. Why? It's the opposite of what Daniel was told, in that the time had not yet come. The angel tells Daniel, it's time. The time is here. It is at hand. It's near. Aiden actually read that in chapter 1, if you caught that. So if you read Revelation in a way that you're thinking this is all meant to be concealed, it's going to be hard to dig into it, okay? It's going to be like digging into a rock. It's just going to be very, very tough. So you have to approach the letter of Revelation in a way that it was meant to be approached, in that it was meant to be revealed, not concealed.
A preacher here many years ago said the whole book was written for them because we're having hard times right now, but it's all going to be okay.
Right, and we'll go over all that. This is all the intro, so...
oh yeah, a few details there.
Yeah, now Revelation is arguably one of the top 3 most misunderstood books in the Bible. Could anyone guess what the other 2 may be?
Daniel.
Well, and Daniel, yes, the last half of Daniel, to be fair, not the entire book. But that's because you get to the prophecy chapters, that's where people kind of get lost. What's other two books that you may be guessing that are in the top three? And opinions vary on this, I'm just saying, but,
Hebrews, maybe.
not the one I saw. Think of another prophecy book.
Ezekiel.
Yeah, Ezekiel's another one, and, anybody guess another, before we move on? Anybody?
I'm not gonna Genesis, but that's just me.
That's a good one. I mean,
People seem to have trouble with that.
and well, hey, like I said, it's an opinionated, it's an opinion. But Revelation is definitely, if not number one, very close to the number one spot, is it not? And you
For
can
some
see,
people, it's the whole Bible.
Mm,
It's not
yeah.
one book.
oh,
it's
that's
the
true,
whole-
that's true, I agree, Melinda.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the author of Revelation. The author identifies himself simply as John. Well, that was a pretty common name, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So, but he identifies himself as John 4 times in the scripture in Revelation. You got 3 times in chapter 1, which Aiden read, verse 1, 4, and 9, and then at the end in chapter 22 and in verse 8. Now, I will go ahead and tell you that in my research, I have found that the majority of the early first century Christians that recorded their writings and teachings and their accounts as far as the church and the way it was and the way the culture was and all that, almost unanimously agree that the John that wrote Revelation is the same John who walked with Jesus as an apostle. The same apostle whom Jesus loved, the scripture tells us, right? The same John who wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, those letters to certain people, and also the gospel account that has his name stamped on it.
Of course, he got banished,
Yes,
politically or government-wise.
we'll talk about that too.
Yeah.
We're rolling, because there's a lot here that we gotta get into before we start looking at, we'll try to cover Ephesus today.
That's why he was there.
So now there are 2 schools of thought as to when the letter was written. And I went ahead and gave you the answers. I meant to ask the question, but it came up before anyway. So there's 2 schools of thought. These are the most popular. Now you might hear some others, but I'm telling you, these 2 are the biggest camps. One thought is that Revelation was written in the mid to late 60s AD. Now, the reason that is believed is because this is before the fall of Jerusalem. This would have been kind of during the time of the Jewish-Roman wars. And there is some imagery in Revelation that seems to point towards this particular event, just as Daniel chapter 12 did. Okay, we talked about that. And also, you see reference to an emperor who ruled during the mid to late 60s. Do you remember what his name was? Oh, I put it up there. See, I gave my answers away. Who is it?
Nero.
Nero. Nero Caesar died in 68 AD. And he was one of the, if I had to put 2 people at the top of the list as the biggest persecutors, as far as the emperors go, of the Christian people, it would be Nero and Domitian. Now, that's the other school of thought, is that if Revelation was not penned in the 60s AD, mid to late 60s, then is it possible it was written towards the mid to late 90s, AD 90s? And so that's another school of thought. It was written about 95 AD. And that's because Domitian was a huge persecutor of the church. We'll talk about him a little bit later this morning, in particular talking about the city of Ephesus, which is where this first church was located. And understand too that John was a smart guy. He was very smart. And you can tell that when you read his letters, when scholars read his letters in the original Greek. He was very smart in his vocabulary. He had a wide range of vocabulary that he used in his letters, even here in Revelation. So, for example, I just put this up here as sort of a reference. So, for example, one must remember that the human author, John, and the original audience of Revelation were mainly, especially John, were Jewish Christian. That they understood a lot of the themes, imagery, and symbolism in the Old Testament. And so this was going to help them decipher what John was telling them in this letter. Because you have to understand that John is under Roman watch. He is under Roman guard. How else is he going to get a letter that talks about God's victory over evil, including the Roman Empire, because they were very evil? How do you think he was going to get that letter to the 7 churches? Do you know how many people would have read this letter before it ever ended up in Ephesus? Especially coming from John. John was an enemy of Nero. Nero tried to kill John before he finally exiled him because he couldn't stand the guy. Nero was also responsible for the execution of 2 other New Testament apostles. Anybody guess who they were? Paul. One more. Peter was crucified upside down during Nero's reign. And so we have to understand that the human author in the original audience were Jewish Christian. And so certain words had certain biblical resonances to them. They were familiar with some of the text that John, when he talks about the woman and the beast and all these other things and the numerology, the 666, they knew exactly what he was talking about. Because it all digs deep in Hebrew and Jewish roots, as we're going to see. It wasn't really a mystery to them. It would have been a mystery to the Roman soldiers trying to read his letter. They thought he was crazy. Yeah. That's why the letter made its way off the island. They thought he was a crazy man. Let's send the letter on. Yeah. This guy's loony. I don't know what was growing up there on the island of Patmos, but it was something. Now, but you know, they would have suspected he was just mentally crazy. So one such Old Testament phrase that we see throughout the Bible was the phrase "the land," and so oftentimes when you saw that word, it was basically a Jewish shorthand, a Hebrew shorthand for the phrase to convey the idea of the promised land. In Daniel, it's called the glorious land, not the promised land. So, but it all meant the same specific plot of land. However, some translations have taken that phrase and translated it into the world. But that was a whole different Greek word entirely. And so that's why we have to be careful when we approach Revelation and we interpret it in the context, in the way it was written. Okay? And John does use that Greek word for the entire world, cosmos. He uses that in the gospel account that he wrote. So he knew the difference between land, or a specific geographical area of land, and the entire globe. He knew that there was 2 different words for that.
Is it true that people who knew about ancient God and all this, all the Old Testament, we might say, then they'd have a better understanding of what these letters mean? Anyone else said some like crazy stuff, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean that was the point. He wasn't going to be able to get the letter through the Roman government and the Roman. You got to understand, this letter would have went on basically by Roman courier, by ship to the seaport of Ephesus. It would have traveled up to Smyrna. It would have went on and on and on around this. Basically, it was on a Roman mail route. Yeah. That's what it was. It was traveling by Roman road. Mail road. It was like the mailman with the flashing lights. You know, that was carrying Paul. Yeah, I'm going to mix up a lot of names in this study. I'm going to warn you. John's letter. So, can anybody just take a guess and give me one reason? You don't have to, but if you want to, speak up. I've listed 3 reasons why I believe Revelation was written to the 7 churches. Would anybody like to throw their answer out there as to one reason they believe it was written before I show the ones I've got here?
Comfort those facing persecution.
Okay, to comfort those facing persecution.
Just straighten them up.
Just straighten them up. Call for repentance. Call for endurance. You know, if you're not doing what you need to be doing, you need to start doing it, right? I mean, and if you're doing great, keep it up. There were compliments, and there was also a little scolding in there. Yeah, to each of the which we'll study that. We'll talk about Exodus today. Anybody else want
The fact that he picks 7 churches.
to?
I shouldn't go there?
Listen, we'll go there in a minute.
Okay.
Hold on. There's 7s all in. Listen, 7 is the repeating theme of Revelation. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that when we get there. But yes, Rita has a very excellent point. It is interesting he chose 7 geographical, physical locations that did have a body of believers residing in them. And when you look into the history of these cities, it's amazing. We'll start studying that. Number 1, and these are my opinion. Okay, you don't have to agree with me on this. Number 1, I believe that it was written to reveal Jesus as Lord and Savior in all of His glory, majesty, and judgment. Number 2, what Seth said, to give comfort and encouragement to the church in their time of persecution. And this was a time of immense persecution. This was not just, oh, he made fun of me because I'm a Christian. That's our biggest problem today sometimes. You should see what these guys went through. And 3, calling the church, as Rita said, calling the church to repentance and endurance. And as we will see in our study, not all is well and going great for the Christians in this time. The Christians during this time were facing great persecution from the Romans, as well as the Jews in the area in some of these cities, Ephesus in particular. Paul was basically ran out of the synagogue. He couldn't preach there after some point in time. I think he preached there for like 6 months. And the pushback from the Jews was so great, he went down to the Hall of Tyrannus, which was this lecture building. Basically, you would rent it out and people would come hear your lectures. That's what the Hall of Tyrannus was. And that's where he had to end up. Because the Jews wouldn't let him preach in the synagogue anymore. And we're getting a little fired up. He got him riled up. And of course, as we will study Revelation, we'll see Jesus' power and his sovereignty reigns over all things. Oh, hold on. Yeah, okay. Apocalyptic literature. So, if you've ever studied Revelation, or you've ever looked into Revelation, you've probably heard reference to its language as apocalyptic literature. Now, when we hear, so the word apocalypse, that's where apocalyptic comes from, right? Apocalyptic is describing something about the word apocalypse, okay? So when you hear the word apocalypse,
It's not scary.
scary, right? What else do you think of?
End of the world.
The end of the world. Wasteland. Every time I have heard the word apocalypse, I've instantly went to what Rita just said, end of the world. And that is how, honestly, that is probably how a big portion of us here as Americans view this word. We view it as something horrible, negative, bad.
It doesn't mean everything's destroyed by this word.
So
It means
I put on here that when you see the word apocalypse, you automatically think of something bad, desolation, ruined future, end of the world. However, the word apocalypse is actually one of the first 5 words in Revelation, and it's the word that's translated revelation. Apocalypse means to unveil or to reveal something. But is that how we view the word today? I've never heard this. I've never heard that before. I've always heard that apocalypse simply means the end of time. But it literally and simply means to unveil or to reveal.
to be made known.
To be made known. Yeah, that's another, yeah. And I just put on here, the word today has been twisted and contorted to the point we don't understand its meaning anymore. It's not clear. It's clear as mud, right, as we say down here in Tennessee. And this is thanks to the faulty interpretations of the letter throughout time. Now, this is fun. So what makes Revelation an apocalyptic book? Like, what would, how in Jewish writings, what would make a letter apocalyptic? There were requirements that had to be made. Just like for something to be a poem, certain things have to be met to make it a poem, right? For something to be nonfiction, you got to tell the truth. 100%, right? You can't have fiction and nonfiction. It doesn't make sense. It's two different things. If you're writing a book about weather and you start talking about nutrition stuff, you're not in the right book, okay? There were requirements that had to be met to make this letter apocalyptic, that word there. And actually, Revelation is not the only apocalyptic book. You know that, right? There have been many more that have been written among the Jewish people. And a lot of them still exist today that you can read. So, what makes Revelation apocalyptic? So, there are certain requirements that had to be met in order for your book to be classified, or your letter to be classified as apocalyptic. Number one, apocalyptic literature often will use rich symbols and imagery. We see that in the very first of chapter 1. We see rich symbols and imagery already at play. It uses this imagery to invest real historical space-time events with cosmic meaning and value. Now, don't get confused right there. Therefore, that's why you see discussions in Revelation about stars falling out of the sky, or this large mountain from space crashing into the earth, and all just these huge cataclysmic events, space and earth related situations. This doesn't mean that we should expect the stars to fall in the sky. It's not what that's saying. Also, it's common that an angel or some other spiritual figure is helping the seer or the person being revealed to, which in this case is John. This figure helps them along their journey. What is that Christmas story? I'm sorry. Which one is it?
The Christmas Carol.
Yes, Christmas Carol. In which the ghost was able to guide Scrooge through the, and he was able to show him all these things. Okay, kind of like that. Not exactly the same, obviously. But this would make it apocalyptic. And so in this case, in the letter, John not only has an angel directing him through a lot of this, but who's telling him what to write? Jesus, the Son of God, is telling John what to write. So 100%, he had two bonus points on that one. And then lastly, apocalyptic literature was very common and full of the use of the words judgment, salvation, reward. The wicked are judged, they're punished, and the faithful get rewards in life or something else great and positive. And keep in mind too that just like these words, we got to put them in their context. So sometimes you'll see the word judgment, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of time. It can be a judgment of a specific individual. It can be judgment of a certain nation, a certain city, right? We see that a lot in Scripture. So then you have the four methods of interpretation. Now historically, these are the most common that you're going to see, or that you would see many approach Revelation. The first one is the preterist perspective. The definition of a preterist view is one that holds that most of the events in Revelation were fulfilled in the first century, particularly the first century, if not the first few, of the Christian era, particularly relating to the struggles of the early church and even the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The emphasis of this view is to interpret the letter's prophecies as symbolic descriptions of events that had already occurred in the past, particularly focusing on the persecution of Christians by and during the Roman Empire. Key points: preterists will see Revelation as a text that was immediately relevant to its original audience, providing hope and encouragement during a time of intense persecution. And we kind of talked about that earlier. Now, as we approach Revelation in our study, we will be looking at it sort of from a preterist perspective, but also somewhat of an idealist perspective as well, which we're going to look at in a second. We will look at other interpretations as well, just to study and to see kind of where they derive from, but just to give you an idea where we're gonna approach the book.
There's a thought that if John had been instructed to write all this in plain old English, the Romans would have destroyed those letters.
Right, well, and that's
whole idea.
that's the point of
They
the,
wouldn't have let it got circulated.
that's the point of the deep symbolism and imagery and
That's
language.
why he wrote like he wrote.
And then you have the historist, and I've heard that pronounced other ways too. That's kind of a tricky word, it looks like, don't it? But a historist will view, they will interpret Revelation as a panoramic view of the history of the church. Basically, it goes all the way back to the apostle era to today. So we're talking kings of England, popes, Napoleon. All these guys are included in these interpretations of Revelation if you view it from this perspective a lot of times. The emphasis is this person will often view and see the events in Revelation as unfolding progressively throughout the course of church history. That's been a long time, right? And the key points here is proponents of this view will often try and identify historical, I just said this, historical events with figures such as popes and kings of England, political figures, and they'll attach them to the Antichrist and the false prophet and the beast and all these things. And so that's, and no, not the Roman Empire. They don't get classified in those categories. It's mostly like your popes and kings of England, you know. And there were some bad kings of England, don't get me wrong, but as we will see, let's see. Come on. Okay, then you have the idealist. Okay, and you'll kind of see what I meant by we'll kind of approach Revelation more from a preterist or partial preterist perspective, but just a little bit of idealist as well. And the reason I say that is because the definition of an idealist approach is to see Revelation as a symbolic representation of the ongoing spiritual battle between good and evil. So a preterist, the difference between a preterist and an idealist mainly is that a preterist believes that the things that are taking place in Revelation, most of them were actual physical events that took place. Whereas an idealist views it mostly as just spiritual. It's more of like a good will always win, and there is no specific event that's being outlined, okay? That's your big difference there as we study. The emphasis here is the view interprets the letter's imagery as timeless truths about spiritual realities rather than specific historical events or predictions about the future. There, okay. Nope. See, I knew that would happen when I. That's why you don't double click. Okay? And an idealist will emphasize the book's relevance to Christians in any era. Okay, so not just the Roman Empire, not just for that, but basically any era in time that Christians have faced a persecution. And basically, there are spiritual lessons in Revelation that talk about the ultimate triumph of good over evil. None of us would argue with that. I don't think anybody in this room would argue that point. And that's why I said you'll see a little bit of that too in our study. Then you have the futurist perspective. The futurist is often a literalist as well. Can anybody tell me what a literalist is? These words are just big words.
He means what he says.
Huh?
He says what he means and he means what he says.
Well, that's a good way to say it. So, give me an example of, let's see. Somebody think of an example where language that was not meant to be taken literal, something Jesus said, or anybody else in the New
The
Testament?
camel can go through the eye of a needle.
Yeah, the camel can go through the eye of a needle. And of course that, I know if you study, but still, it's like that was hard to do. And so,
Well, let's
go ahead.
stop there because I tend towards a literalist interpretation of Scripture, very much so. And so in that particular example, he could have been referring to some nebulous gate that we think may have existed, or he could have been referring to an actual needle. And the camel can never go through that needle, and we can never enter on our own. And so, so there's tons of examples, but there's also plenty of examples that would seem like they're intended to be symbolic, such as like the We just talked about it in Daniel, the time frame before the Jews were supposed to come back. That would seem like kind of a symbolic number, but then they get to looking at it and they're like, wait a minute, this is the time frame that's actually happened. And so, what we see in the text was an interpretation that could have been very easily a symbolic interpretation that was in fact a literal interpretation.
Yeah, possible. Yeah, absolutely. What about another example? And what's funny is when you think of a literal interpretation too, I think of like, you are the salt of the earth, right? And of course, our bodies are made up of so much sodium, and that's where people say, well, literally that means, but, but at the same time, he's talking about, being that good seasoning on earth for people to be able to explore Jesus and be attracted to Jesus, and we have to be that seasoning. So I see what you're saying.
I think that points to, there's so much, and I think that applies to Revelation as well, as it's important for the people who were living then, who got the book then. It's important for the people who follow God all throughout history, and it's going to be important in the future. Just because something is fulfilled in the past doesn't mean that it's also not going to be fulfilled in the future or in the present.
I think Seth and I talked about that when we studied Daniel one Sunday. He said, you said history tends to repeat itself. It does, and so we will see. And you can see throughout time where people have taken some text from Daniel or Revelation and tried to connect it to other certain events that took place, whether recently or, like I said, like a historist views things. A lot of these things took place during the Dark Ages and times like that, instead of, let's say, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century of the Jewish Christians. But so the final viewpoint that I want to go over is the futurist viewpoint. So the definition of a futurist maintains that most of the events in Revelation are yet to occur. And they're going to take place in what they call the end times, okay? That's a lot of times you see a lot of connections with, the end times with tribulation period, which we talked about that in Daniel as well. We'll see that again in Revelation. The emphasis of this view is to associate with the belief. For example, there are certain beliefs or doctrines that pop up in futurist perspective. One of those being premillennialism, which is what I was talking about a while ago. With a lot of times when you read from a futurist perspective, sometimes you'll see it from a literalist perspective as well. And what they believe is that premillennialism, that doctrine of revelation, we will talk about where this comes from when we get there. We're not going to talk about that today. But basically, it's this belief that Christ will establish a literal physical reign on earth in Jerusalem on a physical throne for 1,000 years before the end of the world. And the key points would be futurists will focus on the second coming of Christ and the final judgment. Basically, they interpret Revelation as more of a roadmap to the end times. Okay.
I think that phrase, end times, is another phrase we've warped the meaning of. Because in the scripture, it means, Peter says in Acts 2, what was happening then was the fulfillment of what Joel was saying in the end times, in the last days. It just means we're not changing anything from here on. This is the last covenant. Yeah. This is the last go-round, And that's been since, AD 36 or whatever.
Yeah, when we study, you see that a lot of times these words, they have, depending on the context, what they're talking about, they can refer to something else. So, real quick, this is the Roman mail route that I was telling you about. So, down here at the southernmost part of your screen, I need to get there like a weatherman. But there's the Isle of Patmos, right there. That's where John was. That's where he wrote the letter of Revelation. He would have sent it by ship. It would have sailed to the port of Ephesus first. That's where it would have went. It would have been dropped off there, and then it would have went by land, Roman land courier, up to Smyrna, then to Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, and then there you go. Now, we don't know if these letters made it to other churches in the area, like Ed was saying, church in Jerusalem or so on and so forth. We don't really know that. However, what is one thing that all these churches right here have in common?
There was more than 7 churches in Asia.
Oh no, I don't doubt. Yeah, absolutely, I don't doubt that a bit. But why? What is the? Of course, the 7. We're not going to get there today, obviously. That's like its own class. No, I'm just kidding. That'd be like its own Sunday for real. But let's just talk about these 7. So, does anybody know what country these are in today? If you were to go to the Middle East today, where would you be going to?
That'd be Turkey.
Turkey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And who came through this area on missionary journeys?
Paul probably established all of those churches.
Probably at least the majority, right?
And he was in Ephesus for a good period of time, 3
years.
years, and it says that the whole area was taught.
Yep.
Uh,
And there was a reason he stayed so long. He had to get them equipped because he knew what they were facing. And you know what?
One other statement
Well, we got
that
a little-
Jesus would have in this study, and
Mhm.
day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years is as a day. Just keep that in mind.
What do you mean?
When it mentions 1,000 days, so many.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the language, yeah, we'll see that. We'll see that.
Something to go by.
Oh, no, I understand. So yes, what Dale said, Paul would have made a big impact on these churches here, especially in Ephesus, because it is recorded that he stayed in Ephesus for about 3 years preaching and teaching the gospel. And with the time that we have left, I'm actually really glad that we were able to end up where we ended up, because the next time I'm with you, we're going to be talking about Ephesus. And we're going to look, and so that's going to be really fun. I say fun. It's very interesting to study. Let me rephrase that. It's fascinating because you really start to understand why John said, or why Jesus told the church at Ephesus what he told them. There is specific reason he says what he says, because there was a lot of cult worship, there was a lot of demon worship, there was a lot of Greek and Roman mythology worship going on in this city. It was hard to be a Christian in this time. I'll tell you that. In my studies, be thankful that you were born in this country in this era. That's for sure. I hear people say, well, 50 years ago it was a lot better. Well, I'm not arguing that, but I sure know it's a lot better than what they faced in the first century in Ephesus. Because when you really see what they went through and what they had to do just in order to worship their God and not be persecuted, it was almost impossible. Everywhere you turned, there was earthly and Roman and worldly influence pulling you the other direction. And so there's a reason that Jesus was so complimenting on a lot of these churches. He tells Ephesus, he says, you've done great on all these things. There's one thing you've got to get back to. Talk about that when we get there. But they needed all the encouragement they could get. And when we look into what they were facing, you'll understand.
We study about what Paul was doing in Acts, having Lawrence. It got a lot worse
Yeah.
at the time of Revelation.
Well,
it was terribly bad then.
We'll look at some pictures too next time I'm with you. We'll look at pictures of Ephesus, the ruins. We'll talk about some of the landmarks that Paul would have seen, that John would have seen, that the Christians would have seen. The Christians would have had to walk under these arches that basically said to Augustus Caesar, who is God. I mean, it's amazing. In order to go into the marketplace, you had to take some incense and drop it in the incense burner. Well, guess what you were doing when you did that? You were pledging your loyalty to Caesar. So how was a Christian supposed to do that? Without compromising. So when you start looking into that, you realize just how hard it was for these men and women and children who were living in this era, trying to live like Christ. They were They were trying to be Christ in a very not Christ-like world. Yeah, especially when you look into what these cities would do, and just their practices were just awful. I mean, literally from here to the tree line was your public library and a brothel. And so if you want to go to the library to study or to educate your children, you got to walk by the town brothel where there were men and women prostituting themselves out there. But that's how rampant their behavior, that sinful behavior was. And of course it was encouraged. And some of this behavior was creeping into the church too. But Ephesus gets praise for that. Jesus tells them, you've done well to reject that. Of course, that was the belief of the Nicolaitans, which we'll talk about that when we talk about Ephesus. Because they were an interesting group, but they pledged to be Christian. That's what they believed they were Christian. And so this belief was creeping into the church. There's a reason why Paul and others like Peter often said, hey, you better watch out for false teachers because they will creep in. So watch out. They knew. I mean, they knew how easy it was to basically sneak these doctrines in that were false or evil. So if you want to write these down, you can. I just put these up here as sort of a list to kind of end our study today. Of course, we're going to be looking at Ephesus. Now, if we're able to get through Ephesus in enough time, I really don't think we will. I mean, I had actually thought we'd be able to get through this whole thing today. And I had no sense of time at all. I'm a horrible time management person, apparently, when it comes to classes. So the next time I'm with you, but that's good. That way we'll start fresh. We'll look right at Ephesus. We'll talk about the city. We'll talk about the church there. And we're actually going to see that the church in Ephesus had a really big impact on the culture of that time. You can read about that in Acts 19 if you want to jot that down. Read ahead of the curve. Get ahead of me. And so what we'll do next time I'm with you is we'll start with Revelation 2. We'll just read the letter to Ephesus specifically, and then we'll talk about it, okay? Like I said, we will be going back to chapter 1, but we need to get a grasp on what these churches were facing in their particular regions, because each one was special for its own reason. And Jesus points that out as he writes it. For example, there's a reason that at the end of this chapter, not to this chapter, to the letter of Ephesus, he says, to the one who overcomes, I will grant to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Just remember that. That's it. That's where I'll stop today. So I'll leave you with the cliffhanger there. If you want to do your own study, you're welcome to. I encourage you to do that and see what you find out. Why was that special for the Christians of that city to be told, hey, if you overcome, you make it through, I'll let you eat from the tree of life? Why was that a big deal?